That's Our Time, a Lance Brody story, written by Michael Robertson Jr. Cynthia Kinsey's office smelled like incense and academia, and had a Jekyll and Hyde appearance. While her desk was an abstract swirl of chaos, her laptop computer surrounded by haphazard stacks of papers and notebooks and magazines and books, all well read and flagged with approximately a small forest's worth of multicolored sticky notes, the desk of a mad scientist of the mind. The meeting space was immaculate and organized. A leather sofa you could sink into, giving you the illusion of weightlessness, sturdy oak coffee table whose top was well polished and on which sat only a box of tissues in a decorative wooden box, and a wing-back leather chair facing the sofa from across the table made up the center of the space. Flanked by floor-to-ceiling bookshelves at the rear and to the right, not a single tome out of place, all the spines neatly aligned. To the left, a single window looked down onto Main Street from the second story, the glow in the darkened office space shifting from red to green to yellow and back to red as the traffic light cycled. But the traffic light went through its routine in vain. At this hour, just past 2 a.m, the town of Hillston, Virginia was quiet, still, asleep. Lance Brody was not asleep. He leaned back on the deep-cushioned leather sofa with his long legs crossed and his hands inside the front pocket of his hoodie. Cynthia Kinsey sat across from him in the tall wing-back chair, her slim 5'2" frame giving her the appearance of a child sitting on the king's throne. She wore a plaid skirt that fell well past her knees, leather sandals with thick wool socks, and a heavy knit sweater the color of faded sunflowers. Her hair had once been dirty blonde, but had started getting lighter when she turned 45, and had gone to something akin to metallic silver by the time she'd hit 60. With each passing year after that, Cynthia wondered if she'd ever wake up and find her hair had gone white. But nearly 2 decades later, the silver had remained vibrant, along with Cynthia's enthusiasm for life. "I'm so glad you came to see me," Cynthia said, breaking the long silence that had lingered between them. "When Pamela left us, I wondered if I'd ever see you on my couch." His mother's name caught Lance off guard. "You knew my mom?" Cynthia nodded. "She was a client of mine for, I don't know, 23 years, give or take. Wonderful woman, beautiful inside and out." On the outside, Lance was stoic, calm as ever. But inside, he was ablaze with surprise and confusion. His mother had never told him she was seeing a therapist. Cynthia saw right through him, read his thoughts. "Everyone has secrets, Lance, good or bad. Everyone." She grinned and winked at him. "You should know that better than anybody." Lance replayed what she'd said again, about how long his mother had been visiting this office, had sat right here on the very sofa he sat on now. 23 years, give or take, he said. "Right up until she died?" Cynthia nodded. "So my mother started seeing a therapist when I was born." Cynthia smiled. "From the moment she found out she was pregnant with you, actually." Lance said nothing. "Oh, don't start beating yourself up, Lance. No need for a pity party or some woe-is-me soliloquy. Hey, that rhymes. You know better than that, especially now. Your mother loved you more than anything on this earth, and nothing made her prouder than being your mom." The sudden curiosity was overwhelming. He asked, "So why did she come see you?" Cynthia held up a bony finger and wagged it back and forth. Doctor-patient confidentiality." "Even after death?" Lance asked. Cynthia made a show of pretending to think this over, looking up to the ceiling and taking off her reading glasses, tilting her head back and forth in indecision. "Seriously," Lance started, "you're really not—" In the near darkness, he saw the sly grin spread across her lips. "Kidding," she said, and laughed. The sound was infectious. Lance grinned and shook his head. His mother would have liked this woman. Clearly she had, if she'd been secretly coming here for over 20 years. "You're right," Cynthia said, putting her glasses back on. "My doctor-patient confidentiality with your mother has, passed." "Nice pun." Cynthia placed a hand over her heart and bowed her head. "Thank you. I knew you'd appreciate it. So what did—" How are you doing, Lance? Cynthia cut him off. How's, as the overused and often underanswered question goes, life? Life? Cynthia nodded. Yours. And Leah's, of course. How are things going for the both of you? You're serious? You want to talk about me? I do. If you think about it, how often do you really get this kind of opportunity? She gestured to the room around her. And for free? Lance chuckled. Fair point. Just wasn't what I was expecting. Is it ever? Also a fair point. Silence again. Somewhere on the bookshelf behind Lance, a clock ticked its way deeper into the night. Well, Cynthia said, crossing her arms, her hands disappearing into the baggy sleeves of her sweater. Lance stayed quiet, thinking. Cynthia sighed. Look, I've got all the time in the world, but I imagine there are places you'll need to be. Then, does Leah even know you're here? Leah. Lance saw her in his mind, asleep in their bed, in their home. Saw her hair splayed out across the pillow in that way that always made him think of sun rays, always made him smile. At least he hoped she was asleep and not staying up worrying about him. She'd gotten better with the worrying part, and so had he. Now that they both shared a few of the same gifts, there was a mutual understanding of what was required of each of them. They were a team. Unstoppable, unbreakable, and completely in love with each other. Cynthia cleared her throat. Lance, you still with me? You've got a weird grin on your face. The office came back into view. The traffic light outside the window switched from red to green. Green means go, Lance thought. Sorry, he said. Right. Life. How is it? That's the question, yes. Lance ran a hand through his hair, which Leah told him was getting too long, and she was right. Well, he started, I'm working at the library, following in my mother's footsteps, I guess you could say, and high school basketball season's about to start. I heard you were coaching. Lance nodded. I am. That must be exciting. A little terrifying, actually. Cynthia gave him a look. I know, he said. Weird, right? I've fought devils and demons face to face, and I'm scared of coaching high school basketball. From what I hear, some of the parents in the stands are probably worse than devils and demons. Lance shook his head. Oh, they won't be at Hillston High. I've already talked to the athletic director, and he's standing behind me for any decision I make to toss unruly or rude fans out of the gym. Cynthia smiled. Afraid, huh? Sound pretty confident to me. It's not the adults I'm worried about. I'm worried about letting the kids down. Now Cynthia nodded. Your mother always said your heart was too big and too good for this world. No wonder you've spent your life helping those beyond it. You're right. Humble too. Lance laughed. No, I mean, you're right. It feels good to talk freely like this with you. I'll probably never have another chance to do this. Cynthia shrugged. Never say never. But I concur. The odds are slim. Lance nodded. So what did and Leah, how is she doing? Adjusting to Hillston life? Lance readjusted his legs and laced his hands behind his head, leaning back further. I think so, yeah. She gets along with everyone, makes friends fast. Mary hired her on part-time at Downtown Joe, and Leah's writing a lot in her off hours. Finished her first novel and self-published it under a pseudonym. It's actually making quite a bit of money. I mean, not Stephen King money, but almost what I'm making at the library. People really seem to like the book, so she's writing a sequel and may even go for a trilogy. Cynthia beamed. That's wonderful. Yeah, I'm really proud of her. Is she writing? Cynthia leaned in closer, whispering. Ghost stories? Maybe drawing on some personal experiences? Lance shook his head. No, I think the truth is scary enough for us to not want to go making up even more otherworldly exploits. He cleared his throat. She's writing romance. Oh, I see. Nicholas Sparks romance or, mommy porn. Did you just say mommy porn? Isn't that the term for it? Like those 50 Shades books, a bunch of hot sex on every other page? Lance said nothing. At first. then nodded. I don't know about every other page, but yeah, there's sex. A lot of it. But there's a story too. There's real substance there, and character development, and why are you looking at me like that? You've read your girlfriend's raunchy romance book? Of course I read it. I'll repeat my ghost story question. Did Leah write this book from... Cynthia wiggled her eyebrows. Personal experience? Lance felt his cheeks get hot. I've never been to a therapist before, he said. Are you all like this? Cynthia laughed. Oh, come on, let an old woman have some fun. And no, we are not all like this. I am me, and this is why I'm so good at my job. Again, Lance could see why his mother liked this woman. So Leah's doing well, Cynthia said. That's good to hear. I'm very glad you found her, Lance. It can be a hard thing to go at this world alone, and I'm happy you realized you didn't have to. Yeah, Lance said, remembering that first morning after his mother had died, when he'd stepped off the bus in West Haven. A couple hours later, he walked through the door of Leah and her father's small motel and laid eyes on her for the first time. They'd been through a lot together since then, a lot in a very short amount of time, facing nightmare after nightmare, but in the end, they'd survived. And now they were here, together. She saved me, in more ways than one. And honestly, in a lot of ways, she's the real hero. Cynthia was quiet for a moment, appraising Lance with eyes that ran deep with something that Lance thought might be sympathy. Then she finally said, You know that phrase, a match made in heaven? Sure. Do you think there's ever been a more fitting couple for those words than you and Leah? She shook her head. Impossible there would be. Lance preferred the term universe over heaven, but he didn't feel up to arguing semantics. Cynthia's sentiment held true, regardless. Maybe not, Lance said. But like you said before, never say never. Cynthia held up a finger, pointed at him. Glad to see you're paying attention. I'm a good listener. And besides, for a long time, I thought I was the only person alive with my abilities. And in the span of just a few months, I learned there were actually several others with similar gifts. Gifts. It was a word he still struggled with using in relation to his talents, but he was getting better with it. So, Lance continued, if I exist, and I met Leah, who has her own abilities, then it's completely possible there's another couple like us who found each other out there, right? Another power couple. How interesting. Would make for a heck of a double date, Lance said. Endless stories, I'm sure, Cynthia said, smiling. Hey, maybe Leah could write paranormal romance. I hear that's big. Might be a best of both worlds endeavor, no? Lance shifted on the sofa. I'll mention it to her. Lance, relax. I'm kidding. Lance did, in fact, relax. Cynthia Kinsey had such an effortlessly engaging personality and demeanor, it almost made him forget why he was there in the first place. Why, he started. You still haven't really answered my first question, Cynthia again spoke over him. Lance thought back. You mean, how's life? Sure I did. I told you about the library and basketball and Leah's writing and... But how are you really, Lance? Lance stared at her. The traffic light flashed yellow before switching to red. The clock ticked in anticipation. Cynthia sighed. Look, you have your gifts and I have mine. Even before, I would have been able to sense something lurking inside you. There's an uneasiness in there somewhere. You're doing a good job at pretending you don't recognize it, but it doesn't change the fact that it's in there. And I'm telling you, Lance, it's never good to let these things fester. So go ahead, let it out. Like we said before, when else are you going to get this chance? Lance could deny none of what Cynthia said. He wanted to continue down his path of ignorance toward his true feelings, because really, his life was wonderful. He loved being back home, loved Leah, loved the new life they were sharing. But despite all the wonderful and normal things he had always wished for and was now getting to enjoy, he couldn't help also feel a little lost because... I don't know my purpose anymore, he blurted, surprising himself. Cynthia tilted her head, narrowed her eyes. What do you mean? I guess Lance struggled to find an adequate way to explain, but then remembered who he was talking to and realized just telling the truth at face value might be good enough, assuming Cynthia had enough newfound knowledge to fill in the gaps. Until a little over a year ago, Lance started again. Right up until everything that happened at Authors Adventureland, even though I always told myself I wasn't sure what my purpose was, I still always sort of knew that I had one, that the universe was guiding me toward it. I mean, why else would I be able to do what I do, right? I kept getting stronger and could go to deeper, darker places, and then after the amusement park where Leah and I, well, there's no other way to say it, saved the world, it just felt like everything was finished, that I was done, over. He stopped talking, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. He waited for Cynthia's professional advice. What she said was, "I'm sorry, are you trying to tell me that you, with your supernatural powers, saved the entire world from the forces of evil, sparing our entire population from certain damnation and torment, and now that you've done it, you feel like you haven't done enough and you're just bored?" Lance opened his mouth to speak, then closed it. "Don't be a martyr, Lance, at least not until the universe tells you to be." Before Lance could say anything, Cynthia said, "Do you know what people loved about your mother?" Well, they loved a lot about her, but one thing that always stood out about her was her ability to milk every single drop of joy out of life that she could. She was so passionate about living, Lance. You saw that, of course. She was as carefree and unworried as anyone I've ever met. But she wasn't ignorant. Her exuberance for life didn't come from a naivety of the darkness around her, but because of it. She knew each and every day was a gift, and she treated it as such. Pamela Brody was a woman with no regrets. Lance said nothing, let his mind fill with a slideshow of memories of his mother as she processed Cynthia's words. Finally, he asked, "Why did my mother see you all those years? Tell me the truth, please." "Are you understanding what I'm saying to you, Lance? You told me earlier you were following in your mother's footsteps by working at the library. So maybe—" She gestured for him to pick up where she left off. Lance sighed. "So maybe I should follow in her footsteps in other ways too." Cynthia clapped once and then pointed at him, beaming. "Bingo! My dear Lance, so many great things you've already done, so much you've selflessly endured. Stop worrying that you're not enough. Stop worrying so much about tomorrow that you forget to live today. Don't link your entire identity to the gifts that the rest of the world doesn't even know you have. You're still a human being, just like the rest of us. And at the end of the day, we're all just out here trying to have a good time." Lance stared at her, and for a moment he saw a lot of his own mother in Cynthia's eyes. He gave her a single nod of understanding and agreement. "Thank you," he said. "I'll try." "Good. You do that. And when the time comes where you must put on your cape again, I'm sure you'll be ready. Until then, go coach those kids to a state championship or, I don't know, help Leah research her new book." Lance couldn't help but laugh. "Now," Cynthia said, "about your mother. Yes, she came to me because of you, but—" She held up a hand to cut him off before he could protest. "It wasn't because she was unhappy or angry or depressed or in any way, shape, or form because she didn't want you. She came to me because, just like you and your basketball team, she was simply afraid that she was going to let you down. I didn't know it at the time, of course, but I believe that as who you truly were continued to reveal itself, her fear only increased. I can see it more clearly now. Oh, I wish I would have known these things before, why she was struggling. It's a hard enough job being a mother under normal circumstances." Lance sat, dumbfounded. The truth seemed both completely plausible and ridiculously impossible. Emotion ambushed him, and he felt warm tears begin to form. He swallowed the lump in his throat and quickly used the sleeves of his hoodie to wipe his eyes. "Let me down?" he said, shaking his head, his voice soft. "All she ever did was lift me up. Always." The room fell silent again, except for the clock and the steady sound of Lance's breathing. and then the sound of a car engine idling at the traffic light reached up to them from the street. Probably a deputy on night patrol. Oblivious that just above their head Lance sat in Cynthia Kinsey's empty office while her ghost looked back at him. The conversation was winding down. Lance could feel that. He'd arrived here on a hunch, a bit of intuition the likes of which only people like him would ever fully understand. He had hoped he'd walk away with answers, but these hadn't been the answers he'd been expecting. The universe was still surprising him, and if he was honest, he hoped it would never stop. Lance stood from the sofa and stretched. "Can you tell me what happened to you?" he asked. Cynthia Kinsey had been reported missing 3 days ago by her longtime assistant, Sarah. When Cynthia hadn't shown up for work nor called out for the day, and had answered none of her assistant's phone calls, Sarah had visited Cynthia's home, letting herself inside with the spare key she'd had for years. She'd found no trace of her boss and friend, except a dirty bowl in the sink containing the remains of oatmeal and a half pot of coffee sitting on the kitchen table. She called the police right in the kitchen. There'd been no sign or trace of Cynthia since she'd left the office the day before. Cynthia waved Lance off like the question was silly. "Oh, it's my own stupid fault. I knew I was getting too old to take that trail, but it was one of my late husband's favorites, and I guess, oh, doesn't this just sound syrupy? I always felt a little closer to him when I made the hike." It didn't sound syrupy to Lance. It sounded beautiful. "Trail?" he asked. Cynthia nodded and told him the one. Lance knew it. Had, in fact, hiked it with his mother a handful of times over the years. "A bear got me," Cynthia said. "Ripped me to pieces." Lance's mouth fell open. "Oh my—" He stopped. Saw Cynthia's grin. "Kidding," she said. "I'm afraid it's nothing quite that spectacular. My heart simply gave up the ghost. Is that a pun? I'm not sure. Anyway, I remember walking near the ridge, right near the top of that big hill, and then I started to feel dizzy and real cold, and poof, here we are." Lance knew the ridge she was talking about. If she'd died near the edge, she might have fallen over and down into the ravine. It was gruesome and sad, but not as gruesome and sad as never knowing the truth. "Thank you," Lance said, wishing he could give the woman a hug. Cynthia looked over Lance's shoulder at the clock on the bookshelf. "Yes, I suppose that's our time." Lance nodded, and when he blinked again, Cynthia was gone. He slipped quietly out of the office and started walking home. When the sun came up, he would call Marcus Johnston, his longtime friend and mayor of Hillston, and tell him where they could find the body of Cynthia Kinsey.